Imagine the sound of waves brushing against jagged rocks beneath a pale moon, the scent of pine resin carried by the evening breeze, and the faint warmth of Mediterranean air that clings to the skin even after the sun has set. It is August of 1769, and on the rugged island of Corsica, only a few months after the French have wrested control of the territory from the fading Republic of Genoa, a child is born who will one day unsettle thrones and redraw maps with the weight of his ambition. Though tonight he is nothing more than a small infant in the arms of a mother who has endured pain and hope alike, a woman named Letizia who is only 19 years old, strong and proud, her body still trembling from the effort of bringing life into the world, her eyes fixed on the newborn whose thin cries echo against the thick stone walls of the modest family house in Ajaccio. Beside her, the father Carlo Bonaparte, a Corsican of minor nobility and restless spirit, gazes with a mixture of relief and unease, for outside these walls the island still murmurs with discontent, torn between loyalty to its old Corsican leader Pasquale Paoli and the new order imposed by France, an order that Carlo will cautiously serve while secretly carrying in his heart the memories of rebellion. The boy will be named Napoleon di Bonaparte, though in time the Italianate syllables will soften into French, and the child of Corsica will be claimed by France, a paradox he will never fully escape, for, though he will one day sit crowned in Paris, in his soul he will always remain that boy from the island, shaped by its rocks, its winds, its bitterness, and its pride. The house itself smells of smoke from the hearth where a thin stew has been simmering, beans and a few scraps of meat stretching to feed the family, for though they are nobility in title, the Bonapartes are not wealthy. Their nobility is of the sword, but their purse is thin, and Letizia will raise many children, most of whom survive, crowding the home with laughter, quarrels, and endless hunger, a noise that seems to mingle with the cries of gulls outside and the distant crash of the surf. Little Napoleon grows up among them, small in stature yet quick in temper, dark-haired, with piercing eyes that already seem to stare too intensely at the world around him, as though trying to read some secret script written in the lines of the mountains and the faces of men. The island of Corsica is not gentle. Its summers are hot, its winters damp, its soil rocky, demanding sweat and patience from those who till it, and the villagers who pass the Bonaparte house each day wear expressions hardened by sun and struggle. Young Napoleon will breathe this air, eat coarse bread dipped in goat's milk, listen to folk songs about resistance and betrayal, and carry all of it within him like a hidden fire. By the time he is old enough to remember, he is already aware that Corsicans are different from the French who govern them. He hears the adults mutter in anger about Paris and taxes. He hears his father speak softly about the great Paoli who fought for independence, and though the boy barely understands politics, he understands loyalty and insult. He understands that to be Corsican is to be proud even in poverty, and that lesson will carve itself into his bones. His earliest memories are not of palaces or marble halls, but of rough paths winding through olive groves, of goats climbing the slopes, of the salt sting on his lips when he plays too near the sea, of his mother's firm hand guiding him, her voice both strict and tender, shaping him with discipline that is almost Roman in its severity, for Letizia is no soft mother. She will march her children to church, she will demand obedience, and she will endure hardship without complaint, and from her Napoleon will inherit that iron will which no defeat could ever quite bend. He spends hours alone, sometimes sulking, sometimes dreaming, and it is in solitude that he begins to build worlds in his imagination. He picks up stones and arranges them like fortresses. He leads his siblings in mock battles across the dusty yard, his voice sharp with command though his frame is slight, and when he is thwarted or mocked for his smallness he erupts with sudden fury. His temper flashing like lightning that startles and then vanishes, leaving behind only determination to win the next game, the next quarrel, the next struggle. At night, lying on a straw mattress that scratches against his skin, listening to the creak of wood beams above and the muffled snores of his brothers, he dreams of soldiers, of kings, of ancient heroes whose names he overhears in stories told by priests or travellers, and his young mind clings to the idea that greatness is not only for those born in gilded halls but also for those who dare to seize it. The boy does not yet know how far this belief will carry him, but already the seed is planted. The world beyond Corsica slowly begins to call, for Carlo, ever ambitious, ever calculating, seeks favour with the new French administration, sending letters, manoeuvring for posts, hoping to secure opportunities for his children, and when Napoleon is 9 years old, his father arranges for him to be sent to mainland France to study, a decision that will tear him from the familiar sights and smells of his island, and place him in a country that will never fully accept him yet will one day bow before him. Imagine the journey, a small ship rocking on uneven waters, the boy clutching at the railing, his stomach turning with nausea, the taste of salt sharp in his throat, the horizon vast and intimidating, the cries of sailors mixing with the endless hiss of waves. He leaves behind the rugged mountains of Corsica receding into haze, and with them he leaves the warmth of home, stepping into a future uncertain and immense. In France he will be a stranger, mocked for his accent, called a foreigner by boys with richer clothes and smoother manners, yet in that rejection he will forge a shield of pride and ambition, convincing himself that he must rise higher than them all, that one day those who laugh at him will kneel. He studies at Brienne, a military academy far from home, where the winters bite with cold unlike anything he knew on Corsica, where snow stings his skin and his fingers grow numb as he tries to write lessons or handle a sword. He is lonely, withdrawn, mocked for his speech, yet he excels in mathematics, strategy, the sciences of artillery, and while the others chatter or chase play, he broods and calculates, drawing maps, planning campaigns of the mind, retreating into a world where he is master. Teachers notice his intensity, some admire it, others find it unsettling, but none can deny his sharpness. Among the students he gains a reputation as proud, perhaps arrogant, yet capable of brilliance, and even when he eats alone, gnawing coarse bread that reminds him faintly of Corsica, he dreams of victories. Letters from home arrive rarely, ink fading on thin paper, carrying the scent of his island in words from his mother and father, and he clutches them as though they were relics, reminders of who he is and where he came from. When Carlo dies suddenly in 1785, Napoleon, only 16, feels the weight of responsibility crash upon him, for though he is still a student, he is now the eldest son present to guide a family that struggles with debt and uncertainty, and in this crucible of loss his determination hardens further. He graduates and is assigned as a young officer of artillery, his pay modest, his prospects unclear, yet his mind restless, scanning the horizon of France, which itself trembles with unrest, for the winds of revolution are beginning to stir, and the old world is about to fracture. The boy who left Corsica will soon be a man in uniform, standing at the edge of storms greater than he can imagine, storms that will lift him, batter him, and ultimately crown him. But tonight, as we linger in this first chapter of his life, let us return for a moment to that image of the child on the island. The smell of pine and sea salt in his nose, the rough stone walls of his home pressing coolness against his skin, the sound of his mother's stern voice and the laughter of siblings tumbling in play, and the feeling in his small chest that he is meant for something beyond these shores. It is in this mixture of tenderness and austerity, pride and deprivation, that Napoleon's soul is forged, and though he leaves Corsica, Corsica never leaves him, echoing like a heartbeat beneath every ambition he will ever pursue. And as the night deepens, and the waves continue their eternal rhythm against the cliffs, one question rises with them, quiet but insistent. How will this boy, small and mocked, transform into a man before whom kings will tremble, and what cost will the world pay for his restless dream? The year is 1789, and France trembles with the first convulsions of revolution. The streets of Paris are filled with voices shouting for liberty, bread, and justice, the air thick with the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and fear, and far from the capital a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte follows these events with restless attention, his mind both Corsican and French, torn between loyalty to his island's struggle for identity and the irresistible pull of the greater storm unfolding across the continent. He is not yet the figure history will carve into marble and legend, but already he feels within himself a strange mixture of hunger and destiny, as though every echo of a cannon in Paris reverberates in his chest, urging him forward. Corsica still shapes him, its rocky soil and hard life having made him proud, severe, and conscious of insult, and when he returns there in the early years of the Revolution he finds himself at odds with old allegiances, for Pasquale Paoli, the revered Corsican leader once exiled and now restored, regards Napoleon and his family with suspicion, believing them too close to the French administration. The young officer, once dreaming of leading Corsican resistance, now finds his ambitions redirected, and this conflict forces him to choose not between Corsica and France, but between obscurity and greatness. And so with pain and bitterness he aligns himself more firmly with France, the land where he was mocked as an outsider, but where opportunity stretches like an open road if only one is bold enough to walk it. He is still a young man, his uniform plain, his pay uncertain, and his pockets often empty, yet his mind burns with ideas. He devours books on history and philosophy. He studies the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He writes pamphlets filled with revolutionary zeal, his pen scratching late into the night by the faint glow of a candle, his small room reeking of wax, damp, and ink, his body shivering in the chill of poorly heated barracks, but his spirit soaring with visions of command, of armies, of glory. In 1793, destiny delivers him his first true stage. The siege of Toulon, a port seized by royalists and handed to the British, a crisis for the revolutionary government desperate to prove its strength. Napoleon, then only a captain of artillery, sees at once the key to victory in the arrangement of guns and the seizing of strategic hills, his mind calculating angles, ranges, and the terrible geometry of war with a precision that astonishes his superiors. And though he is still obscure, his ideas turn the tide. French forces recapture Toulon, and in the smoke and roar of cannon fire the young Corsican steps out of anonymity, his name carried upward by reports that call him brilliant, decisive, indispensable. The smell of burnt powder clings to his clothes, his ears ring from the thunder of artillery, and his heart beats with a new certainty that he is meant not for the margins of history but for its centre. Promoted to brigadier general at only 24, he tastes at last the intoxicating wine of recognition, yet even as he celebrates, the revolution itself grows darker, the guillotine claiming heads in Paris, suspicion falling like a shadow upon all, and Napoleon himself briefly imprisoned during the shifting tides of factional politics, his career hanging by a thread, his future uncertain. His small cell reeking of mould and fear, the stone floor cold beneath his thin boots, but fate is not done with him, for soon he is released, his name recalled by those who know his talent, and once more he rises, proving that survival itself is a skill he possesses in abundance. In 1795 Paris erupts again, royalists threatening to overturn the government, crowds advancing with shouts and weapons, and it is Napoleon, called upon in desperation, who places cannon in the streets and fires grape-shot into the insurgents, a moment that will be remembered as a whiff of grape-shot, sudden and brutal, the smoke choking the boulevards, the cries of the wounded mixing with the shouts of the victorious, and though the act is merciless, it saves the government and cements his reputation as the man who can deliver order from chaos. Soon after, he is rewarded with command of the army of Italy, a force ragged, underfed, and demoralized, yet entrusted now to a general only 26 years old, slight of frame, with eyes that burn as though seeing a horizon no one else can glimpse. Imagine him riding before his starving troops, his uniform worn, his voice sharp yet compelling, promising them not merely bread but glory, not only survival but riches taken from the enemy, his words flowing with confidence that electrifies them, and though they march in rags, their stomachs empty, they follow him with fervor, for he convinces them that under his leadership they will become something greater than themselves. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 is a storm, swift and dazzling, the young general moving with speed and daring, outmaneuvering larger Austrian armies, striking where least expected, his artillery always placed to devastating effect, his dispatches to Paris filled with the rhetoric of destiny, his victories piling one upon another until Europe itself takes notice, astonished that this small Corsican, once ridiculed, now bends whole kingdoms to his will, the smell of rain-soaked fields after battle, the sight of ragged tricolour flags raised in triumph, the sound of drums rolling in captured towns, all of it weaves together into the myth of Napoleon, a name that begins to travel on the lips of both friend and foe. Yet amid these triumphs, his personal life also shifts, for in 1796 he marries Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow older than himself, graceful and connected, whose charm opens doors in Paris even as his sword opens them in Italy, and though their union is filled with passion, letters burning with longing written in lonely bivouacs, it is also marked by betrayal and mistrust, for Josephine is not always faithful, and Napoleon, who can bend armies, cannot bend love to his will. Still there. Marriage binds him further into the fabric of power, and as he returns from Italy in triumph, hailed as a hero, his name spoken, with awe by citizens and fear by politicians, he knows that the path before him leads only upward, that destiny, like a river in flood, carries him forward whether he wills it or not. His fame spreads across Europe, engravings of his thin face and stern gaze circulated, his proclamations reprinted, his victories sung, and yet within him there lingers always that boy from Corsica, the outsider who must prove himself again and again, who cannot rest for fear that contempt will return if ever he falters. It is this relentless drive that propels him next toward Egypt, a land of ancient mysteries and strategic importance, where in 1798 he embarks on an expedition meant to strike at Britain's empire, his fleet sailing south under Mediterranean skies, the smell of tar and salt filling the air, soldiers packed tightly, their chatter mingling with prayers and songs, the future unfolding in waves beneath the sails. But Egypt will be both triumph and trial, a campaign of dazzling victories like the Battle of the Pyramids, where he declares to his men that 40 centuries look down upon them, yet also of crushing naval disaster at Aboukir Bay, where Nelson's fleet shatters the French ships, stranding the army in a hostile land. Still, from Egypt will come discoveries, the Rosetta Stone, the fascination with ancient civilization, the blending of war and scholarship that marks Napoleon not only as a general but as a figure of enlightenment and ambition intertwined. As this second chapter of his story closes, he is no longer the obscure boy mocked for his accent, no longer the minor officer scraping for survival. He is a name that commands armies, a man who reshapes Europe's balance with every move, yet still restless, still unsatisfied, still looking beyond the next horizon. And in the hot winds of Egypt, with sand stinging his face and the desert stretching endless before him, he must already sense that his destiny does not end here, that greater storms await, storms that will carry him back to France, to power, and to the threshold of empire. The hot Egyptian winds fade behind him, the echoes of cannon at the pyramids still lingering in memory, the shattered hulls of the fleet at Aboukir Bay swallowed by the sea. Yet Napoleon knows he cannot remain in the sands forever, for France calls, and destiny, impatient, summons him back across the Mediterranean. In the late summer of 1799, leaving his army stranded yet trusting that history will forgive such an abandonment, he sails secretly for Europe, the sea restless beneath his vessel, stars glittering above as though the heavens themselves light his path, and when he steps once more onto French soil he finds a nation weary of revolution, tired of factions tearing it apart, longing for stability, for order, for a figure strong enough to grasp the wheel and steer the ship of state through stormy waters. And Napoleon senses at once that this is his moment. Paris greets him not with suspicion but with admiration, crowds pressing close to see the thin, pale man whose victories in Italy and Egypt have filled newspapers, artists sketching his profile, politicians whispering of his ambition yet also of his usefulness, and within weeks conspiracies form around him, plots to topple the Directory, the unstable government now despised by many. Napoleon listens, calculates, says little but observes much, his eyes cold yet burning with secret fire, and on the 18th of Brumaire in November 1799 he acts. Soldiers loyal to him occupy key positions, deputies in the councils are cowed by his presence, confusion and shouting fill the chambers, some accuse him of dictatorship, others of saving the Republic, and though for a moment the coup wavers, his brother Lucien and his grenadiers steady the day, and when the dust settles Napoleon is first consul of France, master not yet of an empire, but of its beating heart. Imagine him walking through the Tuileries, its grand halls echoing with footsteps, its walls remembering kings and revolutions, now sheltering this young general whose power grows not from birth but from sheer force of will, and in those gilded rooms he begins to rebuild France, reorganizing laws, reforming administration, calming factions, yet always with an eye toward more, for in every decree, in every gesture of authority, there is the sense that he does not merely govern but prepares the stage for something larger. Outside Paris the wars continue. Coalitions of monarchies determined to crush revolutionary France still threaten its borders, and in 1800 Napoleon takes the field again, leading his army across the Alps in a daring crossing remembered in paintings of him astride a rearing horse, though in reality he rides a humble mule through snow and biting winds, soldiers shivering as they climbed treacherous passes, drums muffled by snow, breath freezing in the air, yet emerging on the other side with surprise and momentum, striking the Austrians at Marengo, where at first the French falter, but then, with relentless energy, Napoleon turns near defeat into brilliant victory, securing his position as both leader and saviour of France. Peace follows, the Treaty of Amiens with Britain in 1802 offering a brief pause in the long conflict, and in that lull Napoleon consolidates power, establishing the Civil Code, the Napoleonic Code, a framework of law that endures long after cannons fall silent, reshaping property, family, and civil rights, his vision of order etched into the foundation of modern Europe. He centralizes education, founds the Bank of France, reforms taxation, his mind a whirlwind of detail, tireless, insistent, believing that administration is as much a battlefield as any plain of war. Yet ambition pushes further, and in 1804 the veil of republicanism slips away, replaced by imperial regalia, as Napoleon crowns himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral, taking the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placing it upon his own head, a gesture declaring that his authority flows from no one but himself, the ceremony grand, music swelling, incense thick in the air, thousands watching, some with awe, some with unease, and Josephine crowned beside him, radiant in silks and jewels, though their marriage already fraying beneath the weight of politics and betrayal. Europe reacts with alarm, monarchs uniting once more to resist this upstart emperor, and the years that follow become a storm of campaigns, each battle a chapter in the epic that is Napoleon's rise. Ulm, where an Austrian army surrenders without a major fight, the emperor's maneuvers so swift they seem like chess moves made by an unseen hand. Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, December 1805, a masterpiece of deception and timing, mist covering the field, Russian and Austrian forces, believing him weak until his lines strike with devastating force, the sun breaking through clouds as though nature itself blesses the moment, and afterward Napoleon stands upon the field, the groans of the wounded mingling with the cheers of victory, declaring it the finest day of his life. His empire expands, brothers and allies placed upon thrones, Europe reshaped in his image, yet still Britain resists across the sea, its navy supreme, and the war spreads ever wider, to Prussia crushed at Jena and Auerstedt, to Poland where he meets Maria Waluska, whose beauty and devotion offer him a fleeting respite from the cold calculations of power, to Spain where resistance festers despite his armies, a guerrilla war draining strength, villages smouldering, partisans striking from shadows, a reminder that conquest is never complete. Meanwhile at sea the dream of invading Britain dies at Trafalgar in 1805, where Nelson's fleet destroys the French and Spanish navies, the waves littered with broken masts and bodies, the salt air carrying the cries of dying sailors, and though Napoleon's empire thrives on land, the water remains forever closed, a barrier he cannot breach. Yet he does not relent. He strikes again eastward, 1809 against Austria, again victorious though at greater cost, and then in 1810 he sets aside Josephine, who has given him no heir, his heart heavy yet his ambition clear, marrying instead Marie-Louise of Austria, daughter of the Habsburg Emperor, a union that ties him to old dynasties and soon produces a son, the King of Rome, a tiny infant cradled in imperial arms, symbol of continuity, of legacy, though history will grant the child little. For even as he enjoys the height of his power, crowned not only in Paris but acknowledged across Europe, Napoleon's gaze turns ever further, toward Russia, that vast land whose ruler Alexander I vacillates between ally and rival, and in 1812 the emperor gathers the greatest army Europe has ever seen, the Grande Armée, hundreds of thousands of men, soldiers from every corner of his dominion, drums rolling, eagles raised high, supply wagons creaking, horses stamping, and with this colossus he marches east into the endless plains. The invasion of Russia is both magnificent and catastrophic, the sheer scale of it breathtaking, the initial marches swift, battles like Smolensk and Borodino fought with fury, fields strewn with corpses, cannons thundering, smoke-choking lungs, and at last Moscow reached, its golden domes gleaming, yet the city is set aflame by its own defenders, flames consuming wooden houses, sparks leaping into the night, the heat of destruction searing the invaders even as winter's chill begins to bite. Napoleon waits in the ashes for a peace offer that never comes, and at last, with supplies dwindling and frost creeping across the land, he orders retreat, a march that becomes a nightmare of hunger, snow, and endless death, men collapsing in drifts, horses gnawed for meat, wolves howling, the Grande Armée reduced to a shattered remnant limping back across the Niemen River, the Emperor himself silent, wrapped in heavy cloak, his face lined with shadows of defeat. Europe rises at once, sensing weakness, the Sixth Coalition forming, armies closing in, and though Napoleon fights with brilliance still, battles at Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden showing his genius undimmed, the tide has turned, numbers and exhaustion pressing upon him, until in 1813 at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, his forces are overwhelmed, retreat inevitable, and by 1814 the Allies march into Paris itself, the city surrendering, citizens torn between sorrow and relief, and Napoleon, forced to abdicate, is sent into exile on the small island of Elba, a speck in the Mediterranean, where he walks the cliffs and dreams, his mind restless, his body pacing, still emperor at heart though his court is reduced, his son far away, his wife estranged, his power seemingly broken. Yet destiny is not finished, for in 1815 he escapes Elba, sails to France, lands upon its shores where royal troops sent to arrest him instead join him, his presence magnetic, his words igniting loyalty, and as he marches toward Paris the legend spreads, the eagle flying once more, the king fleeing, and in a matter of days Napoleon is emperor again, his 100 days a final blaze of audacity, Europe rallying against him, armies converging, and at last Waterloo, June 1815, the field sodden with rain, the ground soft beneath boots, the morning slow, delays costly, his attacks fierce but met by British squares and Prussian reinforcements, the field a cauldron of mud, smoke, and blood, until the evening brings collapse, his guard broken, retreat inevitable, the dream shattered at last. Captured, he is sent this time not to Elba but to St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic, windswept, remote, a prison of ocean and stone, where he spends his final years dictating memoirs, walking the barren paths, staring at the horizon, remembering battles and victories, his health failing, his spirit flickering yet unextinguished, until in 1821 he dies, murmuring of France, of armies, of glory, leaving behind a name that even in defeat towers above time, a story that lingers, like the sound of distant drums carried on the wind of history. The waves around St. Helena roll endlessly, rising and falling beneath a sky often grey, sometimes brilliant with sudden shafts of sunlight, sometimes veiled in mist that clings to the cliffs like sorrow, and in this lonely exile the once mighty emperor paces slowly, his boots striking the rough ground, his body heavier now, his hair thinning, his health faltering, yet his mind still restless, still alive with the images of past glory, of battles fought and won, of nations bent to his will, and also of defeats endured, betrayals felt, choices made that cannot be undone. He dictates to those who follow him, secretaries and loyal companions, his words racing faster than their pens, trying to capture not only the facts of his campaigns but the essence of his destiny, weaving a narrative in which he is hero, visionary, misunderstood genius, the man who carried the ideals of the Revolution on his shoulders and reshaped Europe, and though he knows the world will judge him with mixed eyes, part awe, part condemnation, he cannot help but believe that history itself is his final battlefield and memory the prize. The island winds whistle at night, rattling shutters, carrying scents of salt and distant rain, and in those hours when pain grips his body and sleep comes slowly, he lies awake recalling the first sights of Corsica, the hills and olive trees, the sound of his mother's voice, the scent of wild herbs, and then the first taste of French barracks, the cold mockery of other cadets, the hunger that drove him to prove himself, all blending now into a haze where victories and childhood mingle, where Marengo and Toulon stand side by side with quiet evenings by the fire of his youth. Time, which once seemed conquered by his speed, now stretches endlessly, each day marked not by battles or proclamations, but by the slow ticking of clocks, the visits of doctors, the careful notes of companions. Yet beyond the island, far across the seas, Europe still moves beneath his shadow, for though kings sit again upon thrones, they know their crowns rest uneasily, that the memory of the little corporal who became emperor lingers in every street named after victory, in every law reformed under his code, in every soldier who once marched beneath an eagle and now remembers with pride and grief, and already myths begin to sprout. Stories of his genius, of his charm, of his iron will, carried by veterans to grandchildren, by writers to pages, by nations to legend, so that even as his body weakens his name strengthens, becoming larger than life, no longer merely a man but a symbol, a force, a dream that does not fade. The British Guards keep watch, their uniforms stiff, their orders clear, yet even they, as they see him walking slowly under the island sun, cannot help but feel they witness something both ordinary and immense, a prisoner who is also an emperor, a figure who once commanded half the continent now reduced to garden walks and chessboards, yet somehow still sovereign in his bearing, still commanding in his gaze. He writes, dictates, remembers, correcting accounts, reshaping stories, convinced that the world must understand him rightly, that posterity will absolve what contemporaries condemned, and in this there is a strange serenity, for even stripped of armies and courts he finds power in narrative, in the control of memory, in the creation of an image that will outlive him. The years pass, each one slower than those of triumph, yet each adding to the distance that transforms life into history, and by the time his final illness tightens its grip in 1821, he is already half a legend, already more story than man, his companions speaking of him in reverent tones, the island itself infused with a sense of greatness diminished but not destroyed. On his deathbed he murmurs of France, of the army, of his son, of Josephine, fragments of memory drifting together, his voice fading like a drumbeat receding into silence, and when at last he breathes no more, the island wind sighs through the shutters as though nature itself closes a chapter, and far away in Europe the news travels slowly, astonishing some, saddening others, thrilling enemies who rejoice that the ogre is gone. Yet already the seeds of legend sprout faster, the image of Napoleon more potent in death than in life. For what is left is not only the record of battles, but the enduring idea of a man who rose from obscurity to reshape the world, who embodied both the promise and the peril of genius unchecked, who gave law, order, and reform even as he gave endless war, who could inspire loyalty so fierce that men would march into frozen Russia believing in victory until the last breath. And this paradox becomes the fascination of generations, each seeing in him what they wish: tyrant, liberator, visionary, usurper, lawgiver, destroyer, saviour. His body rests first on St. Helena, beneath simple stone, but later it is returned to Paris, interred with grandeur beneath the dome of Les Invalides, candles glowing, silence reverent, as though even time itself bows before his remains, and pilgrims come to look upon the sarcophagus, to feel the weight of history pressing upon them, to whisper his name as though invoking a spirit of ambition and destiny that never quite dies. Centuries pass, yet still he appears in paintings, in novels, in music, in films, his profile sharp, his hand tucked into his coat, his gaze distant, commanding, the archetype of the man who seizes the world by force of will, and even in dreams he lingers, a figure striding across the landscapes of imagination, reminding us that greatness is both dazzling and dangerous, that power is both creation and destruction entwined. And as you drift now with this story into the quiet edges of sleep, imagine the waves of St. Helena still rising and falling, endless and patient. Imagine the Corsican hills still green under Mediterranean sun. Imagine the drums of Austerlitz echoing faintly then fading, the snow of Russia silent, the streets of Paris still whispering his name, and let the figure of Napoleon recede gently into the mists of time, where history and dream intertwine, where memory softens edges, where the emperor becomes once more a boy, walking barefoot on Corsican soil, looking out at the wide horizon, imagining futures that even he could not fully see, and let that image carry you softly, calmly, into the realm of rest, where all empires dissolve into silence, and all stories become only the murmurs of waves upon a distant shore. The story of Napoleon does not end with the silence of St. Helena, for the years and decades that followed his death became the second life of the emperor, a life lived not in flesh but in memory, in the words of poets, the brushstrokes of painters, the verses of musicians, the whispers of politicians who both feared and admired him, and in the minds of ordinary men and women who carried tales of the little corporal into the half-lit evenings of Europe, and in that strange twilight between fact and myth his shadow stretched farther than even his armies had marched, reaching not only across Europe but across oceans, into the imagination of a restless century. France itself, fractured after his fall, could not easily decide whether to bury his memory with curses or to embrace him as a national legend, and so the decades became a long struggle over the meaning of Napoleon, with monarchists dismissing him as the usurper who trampled kings beneath his boots, Republicans claiming him as the heir of 1789 who carried the revolution to the continent, and Bonapartists, those loyal to his name and to the dream of his dynasty, speaking of him as though he were not dead but only waiting to return, and so the figure of Napoleon became more than a man. He became a mirror, each faction seeing in him the reflection of its own desires. His body lay on St. Helena until the 1840s, when at last King Louis Philippe arranged for his remains to be brought back to France, and the procession of the Retour de Cendres became one of the most spectacular funerals in French history, with millions watching in silence as his sarcophagus was carried through Paris beneath grey skies, the tricolour flags rippling, veterans weeping, and school-children standing on rooftops to glimpse the return of their emperor, and in that moment it seemed as if the years of defeat and restoration dissolved, and France itself was reunited, however briefly, in the memory of the man who had once led her to glory. The great dome of Les Invalides became his resting place, glowing with candlelight and reverence, and pilgrims from every land came to stand before the tomb, gazing upon the immense sarcophagus, feeling the weight of history pressing upon them, and whispering to themselves that here lay not just a man but an era, condensed into marble and silence. Yet Napoleon's second life unfolded not only in France but in the wider world, for writers seized upon him as a character larger than life. Victor Hugo painted him as a force of destiny, Byron as a tragic titan, Tolstoy as the embodiment of the futility of war, and Beethoven, who once dedicated a symphony to him before scratching out the name in fury when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, nonetheless kept his image in mind as he shaped the heroic tones of music that carried echoes of battlefields and dreams of liberty, and so the emperor lived in art, where his image could be magnified, critiqued, or sanctified at will. In villages across Europe, old soldiers told their grandchildren of the marches, the drums, the smoke, the laughter in campfires, the voice of the emperor calling them as en faune, and even when hunger and frost had taken comrades by the thousands, the memory of serving under him shone like a badge of honor, for there was something intoxicating about belonging to a story so vast, a story in which ordinary men became part of extraordinary events. Meanwhile in politics his ghost never rested, for every uprising, every revolution, every ambitious leader was measured against the spectre of Napoleon, some accused of being new Bonapartes, others aspiring to the comparison, and his nephew Louis Napoleon, later Napoleon III, rose in mid-century precisely by invoking the family name, the legend of the uncle lending power to the ambitions of the nephew, and though his reign ended in defeat, the fact that his path to power was carved by memory showed the enduring grip of the Bonapartist myth. Even outside Europe the fascination grew, with Americans comparing him to George Washington and Andrew Jackson, with Latin American revolutionaries seeing in him a model of how one man could bend history, with even distant lands imagining him as the archetype of modern leadership, the man who emerged from the ashes of old worlds to create something new, even if it came at the cost of blood and war. And yet the memory was never simple, for with every tale of genius came also the tales of destruction, of lives lost in endless campaigns, of villages burned, of men freezing in Russia, of wives widowed, of empires shattered. And so Napoleon became not merely a hero but also a warning, a double-edged figure teaching that ambition without limit carries both brilliance and ruin, that the same fire which warms also consumes. And this paradox became the reason his story never faded, for it touched something eternal in the human heart, the yearning for greatness and the fear of its price. In classrooms children learned his battles by heart, at monuments his statues loomed, in paintings his silhouette was unmistakable, hand folded into his coat, gaze cast forward as if always seeing a future beyond the horizon, and in dreams he returned, sometimes triumphant, sometimes weary, sometimes both, always carrying that strange aura of inevitability, as though he had been not just a man but a force of nature. And as the 19th century deepened into the 20th, with new wars and new leaders rising, his presence lingered, invoked by generals, studied by historians, admired by dictators who saw in him a model of power, condemned by democrats who saw in him a tyrant, and still remembered by common people who simply knew that once there had been a man from a small island who became the master of Europe, and that alone was enough to keep him alive in memory. To walk through Paris at night, past the glowing dome of Les Invalides, is to feel that presence, to hear in imagination the distant sound of drums, the tramp of boots, the echo of cannon, fading into silence, and yet the silence itself heavy with remembrance. And one realizes that Napoleon's true empire was not the Europe he once ruled but the imagination of the centuries that followed, where he reigned still, sometimes admired, sometimes feared, never forgotten. And so, when you close your eyes tonight and let the story drift around you like the quiet rhythm of waves, think of how the boy from Corsica, mocked in school, hungry in youth, restless in ambition, rose to carve his name across history, only to fade into exile and silence, and yet, somehow, to rise again in memory, more powerful than before, his figure striding endlessly across the stage of imagination, a reminder that the line between man and myth is thinner than we think, and that history, like dreams, never truly ends but continues to whisper long after the voices have gone. To speak of Napoleon in the centuries that followed his fall is to trace not only the echo of a man but the weaving of his shadow into the very fabric of modern civilization, for he did not merely conquer territory or command armies. He left behind institutions, codes, symbols, and habits of thought that continue to shape the lives of millions who may never have spoken his name, and in this way his presence lingers invisibly, like the architecture of a city whose foundations are long forgotten, but still hold the weight of all that is built above them, and the first and perhaps greatest of these legacies is the Napoleonic Code, that body of civil law written under his rule which distilled centuries of custom and revolution into clear rules that ordinary citizens could understand, rules that granted equality before the law, protected property, established rights to contracts and inheritance, and simplified the tangled chaos of feudal privileges, and though Napoleon himself may have sought glory in the march of armies, it is this code that has outlived all his battles, spreading first across the lands he conquered and later adopted or adapted by nations far beyond Europe, from Latin America to parts of Africa, from Asia to the Middle East, shaping the very way modern people think about justice and rights. And in this way the man who once wielded cannons also wielded the quieter but deeper weapon of law, a weapon that endures not in smoke and fire, but in the daily order of societies. Beyond law there is the military legacy, for Napoleon's campaigns became textbooks for generations of officers, his maneuvers at Austerlitz and Jena studied with awe, his capacity to inspire soldiers analyzed as if it were a formula that could be bottled and repeated, his principle of concentrating force at decisive points becoming a lesson inscribed in academies, and though later wars with their machine guns and tanks transformed the nature of combat, the name of Napoleon never disappeared. From the curricula of military schools, for his genius seemed timeless, a reminder that behind weapons lies always the human mind and its capacity to imagine, to deceive, to act with speed and clarity in chaos, and thus even in the 20th century, amid modern wars, officers spoke of him as though he was still among them, riding on horseback at dawn with maps spread before him, eyes sharp with calculation. In culture, too, his influence was enormous, for his rise from obscurity to power became the model of the self-made man, the archetype of ambition triumphing over birth, and in the age of industrial revolutions and democratic awakenings his story was told as proof that talent could overcome hierarchy, that destiny might be seized by one who dared, and so novelists and dramatists used him as a symbol of possibility, while also warning of the dangers of pride, for every tale of his brilliance was matched by the reminder of his fall, the frozen road to Moscow, the lonely rock of St. Helena, the image of greatness undone by its own excess, and in this duality artists found endless material, for Napoleon was both hero and caution, both beacon and shadow, both dream and nightmare, and therefore inexhaustible as a subject of creation. Monuments rose not only in France but across the lands he once touched, arches carved with his victories, columns crowned with his figure, paintings filling museums with the drama of his battles, medals and coins bearing his likeness, and even today his face, pale and sharp, gazes from canvases with a strange mixture of weariness and command, as though aware of his own transformation into myth, and tourists walk the boulevards of Paris, or the streets of Ajaccio, or the plains of Waterloo, and feel his presence woven into the stones. Yet it is not only monuments and museums that keep him alive, but also the invisible lines he drew across modern identity, for he embodied the restless energy of a world breaking out of feudal chains, seeking new forms of order, new visions of nationhood, new ways of belonging, and in his wake the very idea of nationalism was sharpened, for peoples who resisted him discovered their own unity in opposition. Germans dreaming of a Germany, Italians of an Italy, Spaniards of a Spain forged in struggle, and thus the paradox. The conqueror who tried to make Europe his empire ended by helping nations discover themselves, and in this sense his enemies owed him their birth as much as his followers did. Across the Atlantic his story echoed too, for in the Americas leaders like Bolivar studied his career, seeing in him both inspiration and warning, and in the United States his sale of Louisiana transformed the map, opening the path for westward expansion that would one day stretch from ocean to ocean, and so a decision made by an emperor in Europe shaped the destiny of a republic an ocean away. Another thread in the web of unintended consequences that mark his legacy. Even in the realm of daily life his imprint lingers, for he standardized measures, promoted secular education, supported infrastructure that linked regions, and in countless subtle ways shaped the rhythm of governance that we now take for granted, so that when a train runs on time, when a ledger records property, when a schoolchild studies in a state school, there is in the background, however faint, a trace of the Napoleonic order. Yet perhaps the most haunting legacy is psychological, for Napoleon became a symbol of ambition itself, of the drive that refuses to accept limits, of the human hunger to rise beyond one's station, to carve a destiny larger than life, and so philosophers and psychologists alike used his name to describe that archetype, the Napoleonic complex, the Napoleonic ambition. Phrases that entered language itself, proving that he had not only commanded men but carved himself into the vocabulary of aspiration and insecurity alike. And still, when night falls and silence gathers, when the imagination drifts, one can picture him as vividly as if he still rode across fields of dew, the lonely figure with hand in waistcoat, the steady gaze, the rider at the head of columns stretching into mist, the exile staring at the sea with thoughts too vast for words, and it is this vividness, this almost dreamlike clarity, that explains why he endures, for he is not just history but story, and stories are the true immortality of mankind. And so Napoleon lives on, in the laws that govern daily life, in the cadets who study his campaigns, in the novels and paintings that reshape his memory, in the nations that found their identity through him, in the words and phrases that describe human yearning, in the architecture of Paris, in the echo of trumpets that no longer sound but still reverberate in the imagination, and in the quiet moments when we ask ourselves what it means to seek greatness, what it means to rise and to fall, what it means to leave behind a name that centuries cannot erase, and in those questions we keep him alive, for to wonder about Napoleon is to wonder about ourselves, about the boundaries of human possibility and the price of crossing them, and so long as men and women dream of more, his shadow will remain, stretching across time, silent, inexhaustible, eternal. The 20th century arrived with its revolutions, its world wars, its machines and its new empires, and yet in the midst of all this newness the figure of Napoleon continued to rise again and again, sometimes as a hero, sometimes as a tyrant, sometimes as a distant ancestor of modern power, for memory does not fade with time but rather changes shape, and each generation remade Napoleon in its own image, as though the man who had once redrawn the map of Europe now lent his face to the shifting maps of the imagination, and the first decades of the new century saw him emerge in scholarship and politics alike, with historians measuring him against the industrial age, generals seeking lessons from his campaigns even as they now commanded railroads, telegraphs, and artillery unimaginable to him, and politicians invoking his name when they wished to remind their nations of ambition, unity, or warning. And in this way Napoleon seemed never to die but to adapt, like a figure who could march from century to century without losing stride. The Great War of 1914 brought his shadow back in an unexpected way, for soldiers and statesmen alike looked to the past for analogies, and comparisons to his battles were drawn with careless frequency. Yet as the trenches dragged on and the machine guns silenced the romance of cavalry charges, Napoleon came to symbolize not only strategy but also the contrast between an age of movement and an age of stalemate, and some whispered that his genius could have avoided the disaster, while others said that even Napoleon would have been powerless before barbed wire and poison gas, and in either view his ghost hovered over the killing fields, reminding all that war was not only about machines but about the minds that sought to control them. In the interwar years his legend took on new layers, for dictators and demagogues rising in Italy and Germany looked to him as a model of how one man could bend nations, and though their ideologies were alien to him, their fascination with his rise, his charisma, his ability to forge loyalty, became part of their study, while in the democracies his name was used as a warning against the seduction of power, and so in speeches, essays, films, his image appeared again and again, both as inspiration and as danger, both as model and as cautionary tale, showing once more that Napoleon was not confined to his own time but remained alive wherever ambition and authority were discussed. When the Second World War erupted, his memory returned once again, this time in the very geography of conflict, for Hitler, obsessed with history, could not resist measuring himself against the Corsican, speaking of his victories, imagining himself his heir, yet inevitably repeating his mistakes, as the German army, like the Grande Armée before it, was swallowed by the Russian winter, and comparisons flowed freely in newspapers and diaries, as though Napoleon had predicted it all by his own failure more than a century earlier, and thus his story became not only history but prophecy, his errors replayed as warnings ignored, and in this way he shaped the way people thought of the present even though he belonged to the past. After 1945, in a world rebuilding from ruins, Napoleon became less a symbol of power and more a subject of fascination. His figure revived in cinema, where actors portrayed him as brooding, brilliant, tragic, or comic, sometimes in grand epics, sometimes in small intimate dramas, and audiences across continents watched him on screen and felt they understood him as a man, though each portrayal reflected the era's own desires. At times he was painted as a genius of destiny, at times as a lonely soul trapped by ambition, at times as a petty tyrant undone by pride, and in this variety his myth proved itself inexhaustible. Scholars too turned to him with renewed vigor, producing vast biographies, archives of letters, analyses of campaigns, psychological studies, each generation of historians offering its own Napoleon, some stressing his military mind, others his political skill, others his law-giving role, others his personal contradictions, and the sheer number of pages written about him became itself part of the myth, as though to write of Napoleon was to join a tradition stretching back 2 centuries, a tradition that would never reach an end. Tourists flowed in increasing numbers to the sites of his life. Ajaccio with its modest houses where his childhood began, Brienne where he studied as a boy, Paris with its monuments and his great tomb, Austerlitz where the fields still seemed to echo with phantom cannon fire, Waterloo where reenactors in bright uniforms played out the old battle for crowds, and St. Helena, distant and windswept, where travellers with patience and means could stand in silence before the lonely house and imagine the emperor pacing its narrow rooms, gazing at the Atlantic horizon, and in these pilgrimages his life became not only a story to be read but a landscape to be walked, a geography of memory stretching across continents. The latter half of the 20th century saw his myth expand even further into popular culture, into novels that retold his life with new psychological depth, into plays that reimagined his dialogues, into board games and war games where his campaigns could be replayed by enthusiasts across kitchen tables, into endless debates among amateurs and experts about what might have happened had he won at Waterloo. Had he paused before Moscow? Had he chosen diplomacy instead of war? And these counterfactual speculations became themselves a kind of homage, proof that his life was not fixed but open, a canvas for imagination, a puzzle without solution that invited endless return. The rise of television and later digital media brought his image into millions of homes, documentaries narrating his battles, dramatizations presenting his loves, cartoons mocking his stature, comedies and tragedies alike weaving him in, until the name Napoleon became part of the shared vocabulary of culture, recognizable even to those who had never studied history, a symbol instantly evoking ambition, command, and downfall. And in this sense he achieved a second immortality not as man or myth alone but as icon, a figure usable by any storyteller in any medium. The 21st century carried this even further, for in the age of the internet Napoleon became a figure of memes, jokes, images circulating at lightning speed, his hand-in-waistcoat pose parodied endlessly, his defeats turned into punchlines, his victories into metaphors for unexpected triumphs, and so he entered the playful world of digital culture, his solemn image now mingled with humor. Yet even in laughter he endured, for to joke about Napoleon is still to remember him, still to carry his name forward, still to acknowledge his strange persistence in our imagination. At the same time, serious scholarship continued, with new biographies drawing on archives, new analyses reconsidering his role in the creation of modern Europe, debates about whether he was the last of the enlightened despots or the first of the modern dictators, whether he advanced liberty or stifled it, whether his code spread justice or entrenched hierarchy, and these debates showed that his life was still not settled, still alive as a question, still a mirror for the concerns of each generation. Meanwhile, visitors continued to stand before his tomb in Paris, gazing down at the massive sarcophagus beneath the dome, the silence of the chamber broken only by footsteps echoing on marble, and they felt the peculiar sensation that comes from standing near the remains of someone who once shook the world, and in that silence each felt compelled to interpret him anew. Some felt awe, others unease, others sadness, but all felt something, and that was proof of his enduring power. Beyond Europe his legend also spread in new ways, with museums, novels, and films in Asia, the Americas, and Africa exploring his story, sometimes as symbol of genius, sometimes as symbol of hubris, and in classrooms from Moscow to Buenos Aires to Beijing students encountered his name in textbooks, and carried away at least the sense that once there had been a man who had changed everything, and thus even where his armies had never marched his influence had reached. And as the digital world expanded, Napoleon became a figure of fascination in online communities, with endless discussions, reenactments in virtual battlefields, documentaries streamed to millions, and the sense grew that his immortality was not fading but accelerating, his image multiplying across screens and devices, his story available at the click of a button, his presence woven into the fabric of global culture in ways he could never have imagined. And yet through all of this, through scholarship, cinema, tourism, memes, debates, pilgrimages, portrayals both serious and comic, one truth remained. Napoleon was never just Napoleon. He was always also ourselves, our hopes, our fears, our dreams of greatness and our warnings about ambition, our admiration for genius and our caution against power, and this is why he endures. For he is not only the man who lived from 1769 to 1821, he is also the reflection of humanity's endless fascination with what it means to rise, to fall, to rule, to lose, to dream, and to be remembered. And so, as the 21st century continues, and new generations grow up with screens and networks, with wars of new kinds and politics of new forms, Napoleon still appears, sometimes in serious study, sometimes in passing joke, sometimes in quiet reflection before his tomb, and each appearance renews him, as though he refuses to vanish, as though his exile on St. Helena was not the end, but only a pause before his resurrection in memory. And perhaps this is his greatest conquest of all, not the empires won and lost, not the crowns seized and surrendered, but the conquest of time itself, the victory over oblivion, the ability to remain present in the minds of people 2 centuries after his death, and perhaps centuries yet to come, as long as men and women dream of greatness, as long as they wonder about destiny, as long as they tell stories in the night to lull themselves to sleep, stories of a small boy from Corsica who became an emperor, stories of ambition and silence, stories that never end. To continue Napoleon's story is to move beyond history books, beyond the archives and monuments, and into the realm of ideas, for long after the battle ceased and the empire crumbled his figure passed into philosophy, psychology, and the study of human ambition itself, becoming a symbol not only of power but of the human condition, and thus he exists now not merely in memory but in thought, woven into the way people imagine leadership, destiny, greatness, and downfall, and perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the writings of philosophers who tried to understand him, for Hegel called him the world spirit on horseback, suggesting that he was less a man than an embodiment of history itself, a rider carrying the inevitable flow of change across Europe, while Nietzsche saw in him the archetype of the will to power, a being who broke conventions and created values of his own, and for others he was a tyrant, a destroyer, proof of how ambition devours itself, and so the very question of what Napoleon means became a debate about the meaning of history, about whether individuals shape the world or whether the world shapes them, about whether greatness is destiny or delusion. Psychologists too took him as a case study, seeking in his childhood, his stature, his hunger for recognition, some clue to the force that drove him, and so terms like the Napoleon complex entered language, shorthand for the idea that smallness in body could become vastness in ambition, though such simplifications often hid the deeper truth that his drive came not merely from insecurity but from vision, from the restless mind that refused to accept the boundaries set before him. And in this way he became a symbol for all who feel the weight of limits and dream of pushing beyond them. Leadership studies likewise returned to him endlessly, for in an age when corporations, governments, and movements sought models of authority, Napoleon offered lessons in both success and failure, in how to inspire loyalty, how to concentrate decision, how to move swiftly in chaos, but also in how unchecked ambition, centralization, and overreach lead to collapse, and so he became both manual and warning, read by CEOs and generals, discussed in seminars and war colleges, his campaigns turned into case studies, his speeches into examples of rhetoric, his downfall into a diagram of what to avoid, and thus he continued to teach long after his voice had gone silent. In culture he shifted again, not only a character in novels or films but a symbol of the human imagination itself, appearing in dreams, in jokes, in metaphors, for when someone says Napoleonic, they mean not merely historical but grand, ambitious, sweeping, and when someone warns against meeting one's Waterloo, they invoke his story as a universal fable of rise and fall, proof that the memory of his life has passed into the very language people use to describe themselves. And yet beyond the academic and cultural lies the more intimate, the way Napoleon appears in the imagination of ordinary people drifting to sleep, in the quiet moments when minds wander to distant times, for bedtime stories about him are not truly about strategy or law but about the rhythm of human life, the boy who dreamed of greatness, the man who rose to seize it, the emperor who fell into silence. And in that arc we recognize our own struggles, our own dreams, our own moments of triumph and failure, and so to listen to Napoleon's story in the stillness of night is to listen to a mirror, to hear in the tale of another the echoes of oneself. In philosophy he remains the paradox of freedom and necessity, for if Hegel was right then Napoleon was inevitable, the embodiment of forces beyond himself, and yet in another sense he was utterly individual, shaped by quirks of chance, by moments of decision, by his own imagination, and this paradox reflects the very puzzle of human life. How much of what we do is chosen? How much is carried by the currents of history? And in thinking of Napoleon, we are forced to think of ourselves, of the balance between destiny and will. In psychology, he remains the enigma of ambition, for what drives one person to accept obscurity while another demands the world? And in studying him psychologists ask whether ambition is hunger, wound, vision, or all of these together, and in that question lies the secret fascination with him, for he does not explain himself but leaves us with the mystery of human striving. In modern leadership studies he is both admired and feared, a figure who shows that charisma can move armies but cannot forever defeat circumstance, that speed and vision can conquer nations but not always sustain peace, that greatness requires balance. And in this he is not merely a historical lesson but a timeless one, his victories and defeats replayed in boardrooms and battlefields alike. And in popular imagination he is eternal, for he has become shorthand for ambition itself, invoked whenever someone rises from obscurity to command attention, whenever someone dares to reshape the world, whenever someone flies too close to the sun, and thus he is not merely remembered but lived, his myth reenacted again and again in new forms. At night, when stories are told in soft voices and the world grows quiet, Napoleon becomes not the general but the dream, the whisper of possibility, the reminder that one life can indeed change everything, and yet also the warning that change carries its cost, and so his story soothes even as it unsettles, comforts even as it provokes thought, making it perfect for bedtime, for it carries the listener gently into sleep on the waves of history, imagination, and reflection. And perhaps that is the truest measure of his immortality, not the tomb in Paris, not the books and films, not the statues or the parades, but the simple fact that centuries later his life can still be told in the quiet of night as though it were a tale of long ago, a tale of wonder and sorrow, a tale that belongs to all of us, for Napoleon has become not only history but story, and stories, once told, never end. They flow from voice to ear, from ear to memory, from memory to dream, until they become part of the endless current of human imagination, and in that current Napoleon rides still, eternal, restless, waiting at the edge of sleep.